Hello everyone, welcome to a new video which we're going to discuss an IR motion. And with me is Amitai Ben Porat, who has been known for a lot of things, but specifically he broke as a speaker at EUDC Glasgow to an open final, and also has been the WDC top ESL speaker and of course was part of the top ESL team. And recently UCA'd Untitled Spring Open. And there's also the motion that we're going to discuss. It's going to be a relatively tough IR motion, which is why I wanted to have this discussion with Amtai on how to handle this motion. So the motion, I'll also put it in the description below so you can read it there because it has an info slide. I'll read it out. Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed Shiite militant group, has dominated Lebanon's south as a key political and military force since the civil war, which happened in 1975 until 1990. After a year of skirmishes, Israel's October-November operations destroyed most of Hezbollah's aerial combat infrastructure, assassinated key leaders, including Hassan Nasrallah, and incapacitated many fighters. On January 9th, 2025, Joseph Aoun, a previously high-ranking general in the Lebanese army and the Maronite Christian, was elected by parliament as the country's next president. And the motion is this House, as Aoun, would crack down on Hezbollah, e.g., pursue disarmament efforts towards combatants, remove Hezbollah-affiliated parliament members, reclaim areas in Lebanon South. If I completely mispronounced any of the names, I'm sorry. But Amitai, you have an idea on how to tackle this motion. How would you tackle this motion when you first see it?
Yeah. So I'm going to say something that I think is broadly true for IR motions, especially more tough IR motions, and would be my first thought when I see this motion. I think, especially as a bottom half team, what you want to do when you generate arguments here is think of them as two sets of arguments. The first set of arguments you want to think about are the sort of technical, standard first principles argument that you would typically make in a motion where the sort of mechanic is what matters, when you're basing the arguments off the mechanic of the motion and not necessarily the background or the context. So if you hear, political leader wants to disarm a local insurgent group, the sort of first principles argument like backlash or a conflict between them, and on the other side, making arguments about the fact that you can weaken sort of violent insurgency within the country. All these are arguments that are probably quite intuitive from just the way the motion operates and don't require a lot of knowledge. These sort of first principles arguments are arguments that I would advise you to think of as much more vertical. And what that means is that you want to come up with as many burdens as you can to see the ways in which the other side is going to engage with them. Because typically the sort of central technical arguments in IR motions will be the most important part of the debate and will be the ones that teams get the deepest into in terms of analysis, which is why often they'll have a lot of room for vertical extensions, for vertical additions, and also where you're going to get the most pushback and back and forth. So for those kinds of arguments, I immediately gravitate towards trying to break them up into as many burdens or develop as many distinct lines of analysis. The second set of arguments that I think flows from this sort of motion is a set of arguments that are more specky or more context dependent. And these are often arguments that you can make that are more new and more specific to the kind of motion. And thus I would think of them in less vertical and more horizontal terms. So for example, arguments on foreign intervention that we can talk about soon in this motion are quite specific to the actors in play. So for example, Israel's intervention or the US's intervention would be specific to Lebanon and would be specific to the dynamic of a Shiite faction fighting against a somewhat secular regime. And so those kinds of arguments are not arguments that I would typically try to generate in terms of immediately gravitating towards as many burdens or as many lines of analysis that I can find. When it comes to more specky ideas you might have, I would just try to crystallize an argument in a way that is distinct from the sort of first principles, central arguments we talked about before. So this is the sort of approach I take when I first look at a motion, and I just try to headline arguments. what are the first principles and what are the central burdens that come up often within them, and then what are the distinct, specific, often specky, vertical, horizontal additions I can add to those first principles.
Thank you for clarifying that. So immediately I have a question about the kind of spec that you're talking about. There's kind of like two questions. I'll ask the first one first, and you can respond immediately. Which has to do is how do you even find, for example, sources on these kinds of things? Because of course, very different things that people can do. They could just watch, I don't know, like Tildeer, which just has some of these segments discussed on YouTube. But sometimes there's also more in-depth papers like, The Economist, which talk a bit more about these things. How do you normally prepare for these kinds of motions?
So I'll say my specific note about IR, because obviously I think people know broadly what the sources are, right? So as you mentioned, there are many like snap bits like TLDR videos that seem a little less serious, etc. And then there's the more deep diving stuff, like I don't know, a Wikipedia trip, when you try to find out different terms or really reading a more in-depth article. I will say that with IR motions, one of the things that I find fun about the sort of spec collection that you need for them is that the first kind of source that's much more like entertaining or amusing or the TLDR kind of videos actually work very well for IR motions. Unlike, for example, finance or econ stuff where you might need a deep dive in order to understand the process more comprehensively. And that's because IR motions usually are not going to involve like a completely unknown field or arena, right? If you don't have a completely new, different set of actors. They're often still underlying political or diplomatic mechanisms that you know about. And the thing that's important in these kinds of motions is more the snap facts about a country. And with these sort of this sort of knowledge reservoir is something you can very easily get from like a short video on TLDR. So I actually find that those kinds of videos are very helpful. More concretely, I really think that the best kinds of channels for quick IR videos, TLDR is very good for that. I also think the Wall Street Journal has some great stuff. They just don't cover everything. TLDR is a bit more comprehensive in terms of the amount of regions. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Um, Vice and Business Insider have some things, but these are the major publications will all have news on the big ongoings. But I'd suggest that if you want to learn about something that isn't a very, very current event, TLDR would be my go-to.
Okay, that's very good to know for people because there's a question that I get very often, which is how do I prepare for these kinds of motions? Because people do struggle with, knowing what they can say and what they should know, which kind of like bleeds into the next question, which is how do you prove these kind of like more specky claims? Because I have seen it happen where you'll have some teams who'll be a bit cocky, who'll be like, you just assert this. I'm going to counter assert the exact opposite. And then sometimes, it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes people feel like they really need to give like structural reasons. And sometimes they feel like, no, if I just say it, then it should be enough. How do you personally see that line? When do you think, like, how do you prove it? What do you think is the best way to explain why the spec you're saying is true and also relevant and is, happening in the way that you're saying it is happening?
That's a very good question. So I think I also struck. So obviously, this also depends a lot on judging philosophies. I hate, um, I hate when people give analysis that I'm uncertain about whether its departure point is proven or not. Like I hate when I hear teams start from a premise that I'm not sure I'm willing to accept, but there are many judges that are much more receptive to it. So I don't know. The actual answer is it shouldn't be a reason to not run something. Usually running spec will work more times than it won't work. But if you want to find ways to substantiate it, even if just to feel like comfortable with the analysis you're running, there are a few things I'll say. So first, I think the kind of facts that you can't just say are true are like physical, like are either political or like geophysical facts. So for example, if you're running a case about mines or a resource being very abundant, I think that if you say X is true and there are mines in X area, very few judges are going to intervene and expect you to explain that. If there is truly a geophysical condition that characterizes a country, most judges will accept that. The same is true for a political system. If someone just wants X and it's uncontroversial, they're not like in a coalition government or whatever, then usually those claims are going to be accepted. Obviously, There are many other claims that don't as neatly fall into these like very clear conditions. So, for example, international alignments between different countries, or whether the U.S. is interested in Lebanon in this case, whatever stuff like that. These are things that are a bit harder to explain, or ideologies of different factions, or tension between different factions. There, what I find useful in order to prove a claim is obviously you can give like structural reasons why it's likely that this happens, sort of like the way that we prove psychological tendencies by trying to explain an evolutionary reasoning for them, like why prima facie, if two factions exist in X country and they have different religions, it's likely they'll be tense. That's one way to go about it. I like that a bit less. I think the better way to explain why these sort of conditions are true is a sort of very quick history lesson. And that's something there's a class of speaker that does it this way. So, for example, the Bulgarians, the knowledgeable ones amongst them, not the ones that say that Modi's a socialist, tend to explain this by just going through a very brief history lesson. So, for example, Bissert's speeches or Naomi's speeches, I think are a good example for the sort of enough of a history class that makes the judge feel confident that this thing you're saying now is backed by a reasoning that is based on history. And that's often going to be a good way of explaining that. So, for example, angling to the Civil War in this case as a source of explanation for the tensions that currently exist between Maronite Christians and Shiite Muslims in Lebanon. It's a good way of doing that. Something that otherwise seems a little assertive, which is that the factions really, really hate. These are my two approaches.
Yeah, and also to kind of like add on the storytelling that you're talking about. So I, especially as a judge, I tend to see people who are sometimes very knowledgeable and they know everything about this conflict, and then they'll just be like, "Oh yeah, there is this conflict," or like, "As we know from the Civil War, this just happened." And I do agree with the idea that you really need to also add more details. Because it does make it sound way more plausible. It does mean that like, oh, this makes sense because this explains this factor, for example. This explains, something I've seen in the news and that kind of stuff. So it's also convincing. And also, like a very technical note, according to the manual itself, it also does say the more like detail you're giving, the more like it does make the claim stronger. So I completely agree with that. Now we've given a bit like more of a big overview right now of like the meta of like how do you do IR, how do you kind of like prove this kind of stuff. I figured it's also be useful to now just discuss the specific motion. So how would you start from like Gov side? So what are kind of like arguments that you would bring here?
Yeah, so let's talk first about the sort of really the more first principles intuitive OG, and then we'll talk more about CG and less intuitive directions. So I think the first obvious idea is that you want to prove in some ways that Hezbollah is a domestic threat to Aoun, and that this arming it is good simply because it eliminates the domestic threat that Hezbollah poses directly right now. So you can do this in a few ways. The first is you can explain why they're a political threat, why Hezbollah doesn't like that Aoun is in office right now, and why they thus want to disempower Aoun. And the only reason they're doing that is because they're currently and so eliminating them means you eliminate the political threat that is to come once Hezbollah regroups. And really, the other ways of doing that are talking not necessarily about their use of political constituencies in parliament. You can also talk about the fact that they're violent towards civilians in a way that causes instability. You can say that their control over certain areas of Lebanon is bad because it prevents your ability to synergize policy. And like those directions are maybe a bit easier because they don't require you to prove that Hezbollah groups. You can simply prove that their current presence in those areas is bad and that they maintain it despite not having a strong military presence. So those are the directions I would go for. Clearly, this is an argument that, as I mentioned, has a few obvious steps to it that are going to become very contentious in the round. So like, can you destroy Hezbollah completely? Or will they turn into a form of like guerrilla or a group, or will it become a bloody civil war? Is Hezbollah actually hurting you, or is there incentive to silently collaborate with you and to let you keep ruling Lebanon? Will they regroup and grow stronger, or are there other reasons to think they'll continue just weakening domestically over time? And also just the question of whether stability is the metric that you care about most. And specifically within stability, if the sort of threats they'll pose to stability are as bad as like the instability caused by a war. Um, I'm kind of curious to hear what would be your other intuitive OGs before we jump into other stuff.
Actually, I have a one question I have over this argument before we run maybe into that part. The when you're talking, for example, about to a certain extent, are you able to fight the group? Part of this natuurlijk is explaining the capacities of like Hezbollah and explaining the capacities of um Lebanon. And it's very easy to sometimes do this in generic lines, right? So for example, you say the guerrilla warfare, you can set, analogies to like the Vietnam War, where it's like really hard for the US to win because it just, didn't know the terrain as much and all that kind of stuff. Um, However, what I also tended to see is that people struggled quite a lot with explaining why the military tended to be good without just reverting to kind of like a couple of truisms. Do you think there are other ways that you could kind of like discuss effectiveness against terrorist groups besides just saying they have a big army, they are a state, they are more organized, all that kind of stuff? Like, are there more
Yeah,
specific nuances that you have in this debate?
yeah, that's a great question. I think the so honestly, I actually don't think that analysis on military capacities is very country dependent. I think it's just a feature of this motion that is independent of it being IR. And I think you're very right about the weakness of teams in usually explaining the micro aspect of military interactions, but they don't necessarily require an IR background to explain. So, for example, you can talk about the fact that a small country that has been, I guess this is a characteristic of Lebanon, but it would be a characteristic of many countries, um, a country that has been plagued by a lot of guerrilla warfare or by a lot of factionalism. You can explain why often the military training or the military exposure that even the institutional soldiers have is to those forms of warfare. And why often the problem in dealing with guerrilla warfare is that you're just not adjusted to the kind of combat. That's the that's the problem faced by American soldiers. It's not actually that there's a structural problem in dealing with the fact that people are in the jungles many times, or well, in Lebanon's case, in the mountains. The issue is more that you're just not built for combat in that way. And so if you explain why there's been a sort of army socialization into guerrilla warfare, that's one way to talk about it. A less indirect way is to talk about the sorts of guerrilla warfare that Hezbollah can do. Because I think often it's like a buzzword. They'll just become guerrillas, they'll just meld into civil populations. But this is something that's specific to the country. Let's think for a second what is available to them. What can they do? Run to the mountains on the Syrian or Israeli border where they're going to be picked apart even more? Can they meld into villages in southern Lebanon with people that have now fled to the north? In my round, one of the very good things that was explained by one of the speakers was the fact that the op claims on the fact that Hezbollah is going to just bunker down and be impossible to destroy is that they have no civil centers to bunker down in because a lot of southern Lebanon, or specifically the Dakhia in Beirut, which is where a lot of Hezbollah was centered, has now left for the north in order to avoid the sort of tensions faced um, in the south when Israel was bombing it. And so I think many times people kind of skip over the physical conditions of the country they're talking about, and thinking about it for a second could be useful because it's not that these are few people. In order to truly pack a military presence, you need the territory to pack a military presence into. And if there's no jungle, they can't hide in the jungle.
That's very good, and also getting a bit already in the specky side. I'll now answer your questions as you've so gracefully answered mine. So the other argument that I would kind of like run on what you would do as a leader is you could say even if like you might not be effective, you could still say that trying to be a strong leader or trying to say that you're trying to take a stance against a terrorist group might make it more likely for you to be elected. You can do like a couple of generic reasons why people are unlikely to like these terrorist groups, why they're much more likely to use violence, why they tend to be coercive, how it also makes it more harder for the government to do maybe some social welfare plans because you maybe don't have as much control in the regions. But also you could say the specifics here would be, as the motion says, is that Israel has been, fighting Hezbollah, which also means that there's been a foreign power which has been, dealing in your country, presumably with airstrikes, presumably with other ways in which they are acting in your country. And the moment that you're basically acting upon it, you're kind of like giving a signal to Israel, like, hey, stop it because we're also fighting these groups. But also, you might make it that it's even, if proving to a certain why you're effective, not even necessary. And you could say why that perception specifically for Lebanon is important, that you're making so that Israel isn't working on your country. And that makes it again more likely for you to have some stability, or maybe just re-election, or you're able to put in more policy because there's more public support that you have. That would be like another, I would say maybe generic line that you could run in government on why it would be good to fight these people.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I actually think they're two separate lines. So I think the political claim about the fact that you have much more rallying around flag tech, that is very much a first principles claim, is completely independent of what I said, right? Like it doesn't matter whether Hezbollah is posing this threat or not. It's just rallying around a group that we have fought against in the past is good for our internal cohesion, is a very typical argument. Um, and I think you can explain why that sort of cohesion matters more than the backlash or whatever, because it's often going to be much more centered around Hezbollah's regions, whereas the sources of power in Lebanon right now are often going to be those Christian bases, etc. In terms of the Israel claim, I also think that's completely separate because we can just explain why this is the thing that stops Israeli occupation in the south, or that you can market it as the thing that stops it, and then explain why that is what matters to Lebanese people most, more than any other consideration. So I also think this is another independent.
Yeah, it is definitely, it's also kind of way depends on how you frame and how you place your argumentation. So the reason why I see this one argument is, for me, it goes for one specific impact, which is perception from the Lebanese people. And then to me these are two kind of like mechanisms under it. But you could also see it more of a clash, and then you could say these are different arguments. Because I do think I should also highlight they require different kind of burdens, in sense that creating in-group, out-group, and same way that's effective for people, like, is a different explanation than explaining why specifically, fighting against Israel is something that people in Lebanon really care about. Um, so
Yeah, I
I
also
think it's
think in
also,
a
yeah,
sense that you're right that the first argument is lower burden, but the Israel argument has many impacts that aren't just support from the Lebanese people. So it has similar impacts to the first claim on the Hezbollah weakening, like your ability to have a functional economy, confidence in your country, etc., are all also things that are determined by this.
yeah. Okay, so that seems that we already kind of have at least two to three different arguments, at least two of them from first principles, the other one maybe a bit more spec heavy. I would say that most opening teams shoot and try to run about two cases. What we should then do in closing half, if you come up with this during prep, what would be then the avenues? Because there's of course like a big elephant in the room that I haven't discussed yet, which is the general IR politics. You could talk about, how is the West going to perceive Lebanon, specifically how is the US going to act within the Middle East? Um, the main problem that I oftentimes face when either making this argument or as a judge hearing this argument is that it does require quite some burdens and explanations of how different countries act and will act, and especially now with Trump being in the White House within the US, there tends to be some generic rebuttals being like, you could say that, but Trump is very irrational, so we don't know what he's going to do, and therefore this is going to be completely uncertain compared to anything else in the debate. So how would you overcome all of these obstacles to bring, potentially this extension or any other extension that you could run from closing government?
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about the US extension for a second. So I think really there is an explanation about why um, the US and Israel want to support your regime only if you crack down on Hezbollah, because it makes an ideological statement to them that is very important. And notice this is a different argument from you end the occupation, because the threshold to meeting the ending of the occupation is just you seem to be dealing with the problem, and so Israel doesn't have to enter Lebanon, versus active support and coddling by these regimes is a higher burden argument to prove, but also obviously quite has a lot of benefits that are independent of it. Like the direct support of your regime means that you can also claim you become an authoritarian dictator that doesn't really need the domestic support, just through the fact that you have a very powerful military to control the country yourself, etc. So I think that's an independent argument of its own. In terms of how to overcome the Trump problem, like I actually don't think this. I think the bigger Trump problem is not the irrational stuff. Like I don't know, get over yourself, leftist. Like it's not fully true. It's also not true that like that's the first thing. The more serious response is there are obviously many people that manage the security establishment in the United States that aren't Trump and that make micro decisions, especially about things that are somewhat less politically controversial, which, some extent of US presence in the Middle East is not controversial at all. And so you can explain why a lot of those decisions get defaulted to security advisors and the security establishment, the Pentagon that's often going to decide for Trump. With the case of military decisions, I would also say that my bigger issue in overcoming the Trump isolationism angle is you can also explain why, even though he's an isolationist, Trump is also very, very, very allied and respects the military and security establishment and needs to continue showing his respect for the military establishment. And so if you explain a military incentive that is strong to remain present in the area, you can easily explain why that is stronger than his isolationist perspective. Because even though he wants to be isolationist, he also has strong justifications for like the US helping its allies against their enemies, etc. Whereas if he antagonizes the military establishment, that's more one-sided. So that's the way I would overcome that issue. Yeah, do you have any other thoughts about this extension? Should I talk about a few other ones?
No, I think that does answer a lot of points that I had. And I think it's also what important here to highlight is this is sometimes lacking in debating is just the level of nuance and explanations. Because sometimes people will just try to get away with like, oh, you just have, Trump is just irrational, he's isolationist, therefore he will never do this. And then people will just respond to this, but no, but there are leaders that he's kind of like beholden to, like military people and that kind of stuff. And then it just tends to remain on that level of explanation. And I think here, when you're going into detail about why there is this respect, why then, it is likely for you to also have micro decisions that you can make, shows a level of nuance, which makes it arguments more likely, but does have the trade-off that you do need to put in more time for that. And that's why I always tend to explain to people, if you try to run an extension, try to run one so you can nuance it as much as you can to actually make it stand against these kind of rebuttals, but also specifically with a very empirical heavy or very maybe somewhat more uncertain kind of cases. Try to really spend time with that and just say there's a scale to this. So there's like micro decisions you can make, there's macro decisions you can make. So not just about fundings, maybe also just, the way that you deal with troops or the way you use information or like what kind of information you share, all that kind of stuff. And you can still explain why each of these are important. But for that, you do need to spend the time to actually explain it. So I think that does sufficiently cover the US, I think, kind of angle. What else would you run as a potential extension? Is there anything else that might be a bit lower burden, or maybe something that is just very spec heavy that you just know and it's just a fun case that you could run from closing government?
Yes. So a few things. First, I think there's a very fun case that just focuses on why the removal of the politicians is good for the functionality of the administration and the regime, and why a lot of the Hezbollah affiliates and loyalists are politicians that are just very bad and have been the reason that Lebanon was paralyzed in terms of its governmental, in terms of its ability to influence the financial crisis, etc. So, for example, Lebanon's financial crisis was due to a extremely over-financialized sector that relied on a lot of skilled workers. And what happened is that the government was dysfunctional because of the arrangement, the Taif agreement after the civil war that made it so Lebanon has a very, very, very strong, strict criteria for representation, and that made it so there's always a dysfunction in terms of the capacity of the regime to make decisions. And so you can truly market the biggest impact in the round as just being when we have an administration that can make decisions more quickly, we can deal with the financial fallout much more easily. The other thing is that often like the Hezbollah affiliates are going to be people that do not match the economic tandem of the country. Like often if you need skilled workers or technocrats to manage the central bank and it's all the political appointments, the problem is that a government that is very populist will make decisions that would be fine in any other country where this isn't a very like the financial sector or central bank policy is either quite trivial or can be outdone with all sorts of um, other policies made by technocrats. But in a country where the central bank is essentially the only technocratic civil service institution that can save the country, political appointments to it that are done by people who don't respect skilled fields, etc., are very dangerous. And so the more technical note here that isn't the specky argument, it's just you can make the lower burden claim that cracking down on Hezbollah creates a much more effective administration, and that's what Aoun needs. You can make a similar political claim that this allows him to do a sort of state of emergency kind of situation and just put whoever he wants in parliament and then just have virtually dictatorial control over the country. The next thing I would say is this isn't
Can
actually
I?
even specky. Yeah, sorry.
So I have two questions on the line. Just one is very specific. What do you mean with over financialized? Do you mean that it's just over subsidies, or
A few things. So first, they don't have a real economy that is as powerful to back the financial sector. And that's obviously like a problem. Like if you have a lot of investment that comes in through currency exchanges and that's invested in bonds relative to real assets, then anytime there are fluctuations in the market, um, the compounding effect of investments drawing out is much stronger if you have other sectors to balance it. That is what caused the crisis. It was a liquidity crisis because assets were illiquid because they were financialized. If you have other liquid markets, it's much easier to weather through the crisis. And also investors know you have other liquid markets, so they're not as scared of investing in you. The other problem was that the typical currency problem. So the Lebanese pound was pegged to the dollar for a very long time. It made exports, and that because of the political lobbying of financial groups, while they weren't very strong domestic producers of any goods. So the currency was very, very high, and that decimates your ability to run an economy in the long run because no other export economy develops. So essentially, the only industries in Lebanon were tourism and finance. Um, and so it's sort of a compounding issue. That
okay? Thank you. That explains the over financialized, but also gives a bit more context about the crisis that you're referring to. And the second question is also a bit more of a clarification of what the context is in the region, because you're saying, like, for example, the way that you have representation right now means that it's very hard to kind of like not have these people into power, or like have these do not have these into power. Like, what is the way these people got like elected? What is the way that they are able to have an affiliation with a what seems to be from the Infoslide just a terrorist group in the nation? Because it does seem to be quite weird or counterintuitive for people who do not know much about the region or are not familiar with these kinds of contexts.
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so the way that what happened in Lebanon is that from 75 to 1990, there was a big civil war between the March 20, I don't know, it was two March dates. And one of the coalitions involved the Israel and Syria backed, obviously Syria Assad backed, HTS, backed Maronite Christians. It was a secular coalition. It also involved some Sunni Muslims and against a coalition of Shiite Muslims that was mostly the PLO and Hezbollah, the part of the PLO that was present in Lebanon, which is was also it was a broad Muslim coalition, but it was more Shiite dominated than Sunni dominated. And the way that very long conflict was resolved, it sort of a bit mimics other conflicts where the Western-backed component was much weaker militarily, but had the international backing compared with a stronger civilly entrenched faction that was anti-Western. So that sort of led to a deadlock until the 90s. And then they reached what was called the Taif Agreement. In that agreement, as I mentioned, there were the very strong, very strict representative obligations in order to run Lebanon as a joint government. And like one of the most common debates about Lebanon is if it would have been better for it to just split into north, where there are more Christians, and south, where there are more Shiite Muslims, instead of making this sort of very contrived effort to have a representative government at all times. Anyway, so they have an arrangement where all top three senior positions need to be manned by one Maronite Christian, one Shiite Muslim, and one. And sorry, my
And
phones are
the
doing.
last one, yeah, the last one was the thing that got cut off. I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. So the last
Yes.
person that needs to be elected was unclear. Everything else was clear.
Yeah. So I just said the you need to have three a Shiite Muslim, a Maronite Christian, and a Sunni Muslim. Um, so this is sort of the balance of power. And it's true also across parties and their representation in parliament. And in terms of the terrorist organization question, so Hezbollah is, by international standards, a terrorist organization, but it's extremely powerful in Lebanon. It's the strongest political entity in Lebanon for years until now, sort of similar to many groups like, uh, well, Hamas in Gaza. But like, if you're looking for non-Middle East examples, it would be the Vietnam War. Um, the Viet Cong is a very good illustration of what that is. So it's a very strong political and military entity that is disliked by the West, but is very influential in Lebanon. So that's how they get the sort of political power I was talking about.
And it does give a lot of context, which I think will be very useful for the people that who need to debate this, but also when we're going to discuss the opposition side. Before I ask you this question, yet one last line for government that you wanted to talk about. Do you remember what it
Yeah,
was about?
I'll just mention in like as a headline, um,
Yeah.
you can run a very believable case about why Aoun's own military experience against Shiite Muslims in the context of the same civil war I talked about, etc., means he's probably he has his own wish to reclaim a sort of Maronite Christian identity or whatever, and that fuels him in the war. This is a lie in reality. He's actually a very moderate, very appeasing figure, but you can run it. I don't know. And the other thing is there is a very good case about why this diminishes Iran's presence because it creates unconfidence about Iran's ability to recreate um, its confidants in the government. And you can explain why Iran doesn't want to get involved with Hezbollah if it's being persecuted by the central government. And you can explain why Iranian involvement in Lebanon would be really bad.